Our guest tonight is Andrew Morris Foster, because he can't decide which one he wants to be called. And he was born at Memorial Hospital.
Oh, yes.
His father, grandfather,
Great-grandfather
was Captain Charles Coe, who was an early settler of the Treasure Coast area and friends with Ernie Lyons. And he is going to give a program tonight on that era. So, is there something else? Oh yes, we got the new throw-in today, which will be for sale. It's available at the museum. You can see it. It's going to be for Christmas, but we ordered them, and only one is here. You can see it, and then you can put in an order form and pay when they come. We will have a November program. Alice is going to do a program about her new book, which is back there on the table so you can look at it. She's going to show pictures and do a complete talk on it. And we'll welcome her, I think it's November the 8th. So on Election Day, when you're tired of all that, come on in and see Alice's program. All right, does anybody else have an announcement they want to make before I turn it over to Mr. Coe? Okay, here you go, Mr. Foster.
There you go. Close enough. We're going to go low-tech. I have little booklets with some pictures and such that you can all look through, and a lot of the family-type photos of him, some other things, and if you want to just pass these around a little bit. And that way, hopefully, everybody can get to look through them. And that, by the way, is my daughter who's handing out the booklets to you. Sorry for moving around too much. Obviously, my name is Andrew Foster. For many years, I only knew my name as Morris. I had no idea I had a first name until I was in third grade. So, my great-grandfather, I grew up hearing all the stories most of my life, living with my grandparents and my uncles, and my mother was a Coe, and all the neat and wonderful things he did from even as a child. He just did so many things that crisscrossed the country. Originally, he was born in Connecticut in 1856. And my great-great-great-grandfather was a copper baron and owned 4 copper mines in Eagle Harbor, Michigan. So our family would crisscross back and forth to Eagle Harbor, Michigan, where my great-great-grandfather would run the copper mines. Unfortunately, copper mining was very hazardous to one's health. And eventually, he would quit for a few years. As soon as he'd feel better, they would entice him back for more money, and he would run the mines, and he would get sick again, and this went on and on and on. But eventually, they wound up in Wisconsin, Ohio. They wound up almost everywhere. But when they were in Wisconsin, my great-grandfather had read an article about how Benjamin Franklin had learned everything he knew from working as a printer and for newspapers. And that was it. He was hooked. He said, that's what I want to be. I want to become a newspaper man. By the age of 10, it was right in the middle of the Civil War, so men were hard to come by that were able-bodied, and he actually applied for a newspaper job for the Wisconsin Press. By the age of 10, they liked his work so much he was making $2 a week, which was good money from the Civil War era. But they needed him back on the dairy farm at home, and they had a very large dairy farm. They had 1 whole cow, and he eventually decided he had to quit and go back on the farm, and they said they couldn't do without him. They gave him $1 raise per week. So at the age of 10, he was making $3 a week, which was fantastic money in those days. But eventually he did give it up, and they wound up moving, and they tried to stay up north there, but eventually my great-grandfather couldn't take the cold anymore. He was suffering from what was known as silicosis in those days, from working in the copper mines. And eventually they had a letter from a friend of theirs in New Smyrna Beach, and said, you need to come down here. The winters are fantastic. They're just, you wouldn't believe them. So they came down in the winter of 1873 and settled the rest of the family in Jacksonville. And then he moved on ahead to New Smyrna to acquire land and find, see how it would be, and if everything was good, then they would build a house, and then they would go from there. Of course, my great-great-grandfather, by this time was a teenager, and decided while he's in Jacksonville, he wanted to work for a newspaper. Well, in those days, you had to be a union to even think about it. So what they did is he joined the union, the local 162. I believe it or not, I have his 1873 union card at home that was saved. And a little background on that, my grandfather saved everything as much as he possibly could, thank God. But he kept it in a shed with a flat roof, unfortunately, when we all know what happens in flat roofs. Eventually in Florida, we all start leaking. And destroyed a lot of things over the years, but a lot of it was saved. And then when he passed away, my uncle wound up with it. Unfortunately, he wouldn't let any of us see any of it. We never understood that. He kept it locked in a room, and even when I came over to his house to do work for him, he would never let me in that room. Never understood it, never could figure that out, but I stayed in good with him. And the beginning of 2005, his wife died, and then he was diagnosed with cancer, and he was 90 years old at that point. And he finally told me, he said, "Look, I can't take this stuff with me. If you want it, you can have it. Otherwise, throw it away." And I said, "Are you kidding? There's stuff from the 1800s. I can't throw this stuff away. I'm kind of a history buff and a nut. I can't do that." So I wound up helping him settle all of his affairs. We got his house cleaned up. I hauled all that stuff to my house. And much to my wife's chagrin, because it's still stacked up to the rafters in my dining room. And I'm still going through it since '05. I'm still finding stuff today that I didn't even know that I had. A few months ago, I literally found that picture, which was the metal tintype of their home in the 1880s from New Smyrna Beach. I had no idea this existed, and here I find it in a box. It's been sitting in front of me for a couple of years. But it's interesting that when he was in New Smyrna, they finally moved to New Smyrna. Charles Coe, which was my great-grandfather, decided he was going to start his own newspaper. And he had been given land from his great-grandfather, who gave them all money to buy land while they were there. So he and his brothers and his parents all had their own individual land, but he wanted to start that newspaper, so he sold it. And what he did from there was use that money, was going to start his own newspaper. Unfortunately, he didn't make enough money. So he then turned around and cleared the land for the people who bought it, made more money doing that than he's selling it. So he wound up buying himself a push-pedal press, drove all the way from New Smyrna on Christmas Day to Jacksonville in a wagon by himself to pick up this press. They loaded it on his wagon, and he drove all the way back by himself, and it was supposedly at that time a record cold. He almost froze to death on the way back, except he found somebody on the side of the road with a fire, and he pulled up. They chatted for a little while, shared some hot eggnog, and then he went on his way. But the story pretty much, a few moments I'm going to put on a hat, and normally when I wear that hat, I try to go into the character of my great-grandfather. And I have to explain that because the last talk I did, I was talking about the book that he wrote in 1898, and I said it as the character, and somebody said, "Excuse me, you look awfully young for somebody that wrote a book in 1898. And I said, "No, I'm in character." But for those of you that don't know who Charles Coe was, he's one of those little niches in history that most people do not know about. How many people here have actually heard of Charles Coe? Except for that person back there. He's most famed for a book that he wrote in 1898, which was called Red Patriots. And what people don't know is that it was a whistleblowing book on the government, because he wanted to fight against what the government was doing to the Seminoles in that time. And even in 1898, they were still under the Indian Removal Act and were still being hauled off to Oklahoma against their will. And he didn't like that. And coming to Florida, he heard quite a bit about the Seminoles. And he'd read books, everything that he possibly could on the subject, and decided one day he was going to write a book, and that's what he did. So basically, I'm going to put on my hat and I'll try to be in character. And one of the questions I'm always asked is, how come I don't change my voice? And I said, well, I'm often told that I sound a lot like my grandfather when I speak, so I'm assuming he sounds a lot like his father. So there's what the assumption is. So before the first person asks that question, now if you were to run into Captain Coe at any given time, this is pretty much the way you saw him dressed. If you look through that booklet, you'll see some examples of him. There's a great one there on the table where he's on the docks in West Palm Beach in 1943 in his 30-foot cabin cruiser. And he spent a lot of time going up and down the coast of Florida as an amateur archaeologist in the day exploring Indian mounds. And there's a handful of artifacts in that little cabinet there if you'd like to come up later and look at it. There's even some little handouts if you'd like them to. There's even a couple of discs. I just give them away and I don't ask anything in return. But this is the way you would find him dressed. Now, how in the world they did this year-round is beyond me. I do air conditioning for a living, and I'm squandering around that little attic of yours at 130 degrees, and I'm dressed in a light shirt. I don't know how they did it like this, but here we go, and we'll see what happens. Well, thank you all for coming. My name is Charles Coe. I was born in 1856, and born in Torrington, Connecticut. How many of you are here from Connecticut? Ah, we got one here from Connecticut. My grandfather was a copper baron in the day, and we traveled all about, as obviously my protege said, about back and forth to Michigan and such. But my parents decided, even at a young age, that I should read fine literature and become as educated as humanly possible in the day. I did go to a few fine schools in Connecticut, but we traveled so much that my mother decided we were going to be homeschooled, my brothers and I. And there were 5 of us all together. We traveled quite a bit. My oldest brother became a telegraph operator for the railroad and moved out west. So my other brother was working in a factory in Wisconsin. Sadly, he was stopping for lunch and was sitting in the big picture window eating his lunch, and some boys were out in the woods hunting and accidentally shot him. But that was the way things happened in those days. It wasn't much of an investigation. Nobody was at fault. It was an accident. My brother in the telegraph office, sadly one day, was in a train wreck traveling to a new station to operate in, and he was killed. So it was just my other brother and I, and my mother and father, when we moved to Florida. And from there, we took up a homestead just west of New Smyrna Beach. How many of you know New Smyrna? It was a very small town in 1874 when we moved there. My father, of course, bought 36 acres at that time and decided he was going to grow oranges, various fruit trees. At one time, we had over 1,000 orange trees on that property. Then, of course, as you heard, I decided to start my own newspaper. I was very determined to do this. We decided to do it as a family deal. My father became the chief editor. I, of course, was the editor-owner, and my brother did all the hard work. We loved doing that to him. But we printed out of New Smyrna. It was a small paper. I think we were only asking 75 cents a year for a weekly issue. But we often sent them up north to Connecticut, D.C., all the northern places, because we did a lot of promoting the area for farming, because it was a rich soil area at the time. So we did a lot of sending papers up there. I still have envelopes. I still have some of the original newspapers from the 1870s. But I was just a young boy. I was only 21 when I started my newspaper in 1877. Eventually, I moved it into town, and we worked out of one of the buildings there. My brother decided to become the New Smyrna Beach's postmaster, so they had this little tiny shack that just said post office on it right next to the train tracks. And whenever he'd hear the train come around, he'd run out there and put his hat on, and he would be picking up the mail for everybody. But unfortunately, my father got a little tired of the oranges and decided to take a post as a port collector. New Smyrna was a point of entry in those days, in the early 1800s. on into the 19th century. But he sadly was only the port collector for 6 months, and he died of silicosis, which finally overcame him, which is a fluid buildup in the lungs from the silicone that apparently was disturbed when you would mine for the copper. Sadly, I became very disillusioned in the newspaper because at that point I had to post my father's obituary, which was a front page. And I started to tire of the newspaper because now it was just myself and my brother could only do it part-time. So finally, I decided to sell the newspaper and start up other endeavors. I even took up photography for a while. I bought a photography tent, as they called it, where it was 40 feet long when you set it up, and the back 15 feet was a darkroom. So you could do your own photography. And I tell you what, I was making pretty good money in the early 1880s. I was making almost $12 a day, which was darn good money. But I eventually tired of that, tried a few other things, worked for another newspaper in Jacksonville, and then came back. And I finally decided it was time to move on. And I moved to the Carolinas, Highlands, North Carolina. Anyone familiar with that area? It's up in the mountains there. And I decided to start my next newspaper, which was the Highland Star, in 1890. Unfortunately, not being from the Carolinas, I was not well received. So they didn't really care too much for my news. Eventually, at one point, there was a dispute between the neighboring town. They wanted to get a bond passed for a railroad going through their town. But it wasn't anywhere near us. We couldn't benefit from it. So I wrote in the newspaper, why in the world would we want to pay for something we have no use for? Well, the neighboring town didn't like that, and they wrote in their newspaper that they called me the barking dog. And they compared me to the devil for standing up against this bond. Well, eventually I said, well, whatever you people want to do. And of course, they voted to help with the bond, which helped them in no way whatsoever. They never benefited from it at all. Eventually, I decided to close down the newspaper after only a year. I still have all but 2 issues of the 1890s paper. Moved to D.C. and finally found a job as a printer for the government, which lasted me 30 years. I still have my printers union pin for 50 years of service as a printer. While I was there, I had met quite a few interesting people and rights activists who were very interested in the Seminoles, which I was too. And I finally decided this was the time to write my book. I wrote several articles on Osceola and a few other people. But what really got my interest is when I was a young man, there was a particular author that I liked. I mean, I really loved his novels. He wrote mostly swashbuckling novels in the day. And I just loved what he wrote. And his name was Mayne Reid, and often called Captain Mayne Reid. He was a Scotsman who wrote in the 1850s through the 1880s. Unfortunately, when he passed away, I was very heartbroken. But I love the man so dearly, I named my first son after him. So that's how far I went into it. But he wrote a book about Osceola, which caught my interest back when I was a young boy. And that was my first inkling into the Seminole world, and decided that's where I needed to go. So I accumulated anything and everything that I could find on the Seminoles. Books, magazines. I spent days inside the National Library there in D.C. I was just soaking it in. I finally wrote my book, Red Patriots. It was finally published in 1898. I think if you look in the little booklet there, you'll even see my card that I submitted for the copyright from the library there, the National Library. But we eventually, when I published it, it sparked rights activist groups actually behind it. There was a group called Friends of the Seminoles, and they actually used to rally around that book to fight for the Seminole rights. And at that point, I was not worried about them, but I was wandering the halls of Congress in those days when you could. Nobody would arrest you or tackle you. And I would walk around with pockets full of these books. And what I would do is when I would find a congressman, I would tackle one and say, I'm Mr. Coe, glad to meet you. And the first thing they would say is, Coe, are you related to the Congressman Coe? And he said, well, yes, that's my grandfather. And the other co's, we had other co's. My uncles were congressmen. I even had one in the House of Representatives, so they would give me the time of day. And I would hand them these books and explain to them, you need to give the Seminoles the rights to stay in Florida, and this is why. And it took about 20 years, which is actually pretty quick for the government. But you got to also realize you had the land grabbers, the landowners in Florida that wanted that land from the Seminoles. So, well, they were pushing on the other side. Unfortunately, compromise with the government became to put them on reservations, which is not where they wanted to be in the first place. And that's not what I wanted. I said, well, where they live is where they should be, is where they should stay, not be herded onto reservations. But unfortunately, that's the way it went. I moved on to other endeavors, but Red Patriots became quite an interesting book in the time, because I wrote it to prick the consciousness of the people, to let them see what was wrong with what we were doing to the Seminoles. Because, they didn't deserve to be hauled off. They were still under the Indian Removal Act at that time, and still being taken to Oklahoma. How would you like somebody to come to your house and drag you off to a state that you just didn't want to go to? But I later on, after about 30 years of being in the Printers Union, I finally retired in the 1920s. I first actually went to Miami, and I liked it down there, but after a while I got restless and decided to endeavor into other things, and that's when I became an amateur archaeologist and spent years going up and down the coast of Florida here, all the way down to Cuba, out to NASA and back. I covered quite a bit of ground. I liked all the different areas. I finally wound up here in Stuart. And my endeavor at that time was to follow the trail of Jonathan Dickinson. How many people are familiar with Jonathan Dickinson? At least we got a few of them. How many have a copy of Jonathan Dickinson's journal? At least one. There are two intros in that. One was both of them were close and dear friends of mine, Bessie DuBois of Jupiter's DuBois Park, and of course Ernest Lyons. And if you look in there, there's 3 pages dedicated to me and our first intro together. What I did is I would often go to the local newspapers to meet the people in newsrooms, and we had a kindred spirit. I was a newspaper man, they were a newspaper man, and I would tell the stories. And most of them would always publish articles about me. I still have some of those articles. But I walked into the Stuart News one day in the 1930s and asked to see one of the reporters. It was only one happened to be at his desk, so I came waltzing in and I sat down and I put down my 5th edition of Jonathan Dickinson's journal. And I said, I'm Mr. Coe. I'm going to go exploring where the trail leads all the way up north. I want to see these places where the encampments were. I want to find where they possibly stayed. He said, would you like to help me? And of course, from why Ernest jumped up, grabbed his coat and said, let's go. And that was Ernest. And we would go out on these little adventures. And I took him out on my 30-foot boat called the Buccaneer, after Mayne Reid's books. And we would go exploring up and down in the Hope Sound area, Stuart. One of our favorite places to go was Peck's Lake. And if you look in the book there, you will see a picture of me standing by the water. And that was taken by Ernest Lyons in 1938. And if you squint real hard, you'll see a little white dot in the back, and that's the Buccaneer. But we would often go exploring Indian mounds all day long, and then we would find a little area. We'd scoop up a whole bunch of oysters, and we would build a little fire, and we would roast oysters and have wine and read poetry. That was our day. But the first time we went out onto the Jupiter Island, what is now known as Jupiter Island, and we went exploring, and I said, this is the spot. This is a burial mound right here. And he said, how can you tell? Well, here's the kitchen area over here, so the mound should be right over here. And he goes, really? How can you tell? He said, I've been doing this so long, I know exactly where they are. So we walked over, and sure enough, there was a little sand mound. And I said, well, here, take a shovel. We're going to start digging. And Ernest is like, we're going to start digging? He said, yeah, just right there. That's a good spot. Dig from the side. Don't dig it, because if you dig from the top, you'll destroy it. Dig from the side. And he starts digging, and finally he's like, what? He hit something. He said, oh, you found something. And Ernest is like, well, what is that? He said, just keep digging, keep digging. And he reaches in, and lo and behold, he pulls the skull out. And Ernest is like, "Oh my God, what is this?" I said, "Well, that's a skull. That's an Indian skull." "Well, what do I do with it?" "Well, it's yours. You found it. Do what you want to do with it." So Ernest just kind of stood there for a minute. He bent back down. He put it back in the hole and covered it right back up. Of course, he turned to me because he knew I had quite a collection. He says, "You know what? I think that one should stay right there. And you know what? I think you have one too many. And I think you should leave yours here too." I wasn't too happy about that, but he was right. And I never collected another Indian bone again after that. But he and I would go up and down this river, I don't know how many times. There's even a picture of, I think it's us on Fraser Creek here, if you look close, with the old boathouse in the background. That was taken in the 1930s also. But we covered quite a bit of ground, Ernest and I. It's amazing, what friendships you can make with people in the news business. But I wound up in West Palm Beach for a good number of years. I even owned land here at one time and eventually sold it. I could never seem to stay in one spot for too many years. I would always move around quite a bit. Wound up with a boatload, literally, of artifacts at one point. And eventually I settled down in West Palm. A little place called Flamingo Park was nearby, and there's actually a Flagler Park by the water, and that's where I spent a lot of my time, and figured this is where I'm going to grow old, and this is where I'm going to die. Of course, at this point, I'm in my 80s, and my son was getting a little concerned because here I was living in a boat by myself in the middle of West Palm Beach, and he was getting a little worried that something could happen to me, as if it couldn't have happened by this point. So by the time I hit my early 90s, he moved to Florida to settle down and retire here, and he settled in Jupiter. And he decided that I needed to live with him. And of course I said no, and he said yes, and we kind of argued, and before I knew it, I was being dragged off my boat kicking and screaming. And I had to sell the Buccaneer. I think you even see a flyer in there for one of my Buccaneers that I sold. But eventually I wound up in Jupiter with my son, and my grandson was there, and his children and such. And my son bought a motel right on the waterway. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Jupiter area on the beach there, but there's a little place called the Juneau Ranch way back in the day. And he owned all of that property, owned 5 acres right on the water. And what he would do is sometimes if he and my grandson had to go into town, they would put me behind the counter, and I loathed that job. Did not want to stand there and help people to a room. But we stayed there. The funny thing was, when my son bought it, literally right after he bought it, the real estate agent kept saying, it's getting to be hurricane season. You might want to consider getting insurance for your hotel. And they're like, "Well, why would we get insurance?" He said, "Well, here, when we get big storms, they can knock buildings down and wash them away, and you're right on the edge of the water." So he talked it over with his son, and they went back and forth. Finally, they decided, okay, we'll get insurance. They bought the insurance. The very next day, the 1951 hurricane came through and blew it into the ocean. So, thank God they got insurance, and they rebuilt, put up a whole new building and everything, and then later on, when times got tough, he sectioned off the property and sold some of it, and then they built a big motel with a pool and air conditioning, and that finally put him out of business. So, but sadly for me, my son's house was up on high steps about this high and had what they call a half basement underneath there. I don't know if any of you are familiar with those, where you stand in the basement, you can look out from under the house. So they had very high concrete steps. Well, sadly, one day I was traversing the back stairs and fell. And unfortunately, sadly broke my hip and wound up in the hospital, and of course recovering, caught pneumonia, and we all know what happens at that point. But don't want to run you guys too late here, but let me go out of character here for a few moments. But a hat gets hot after a while. But I fortunately consider myself very lucky, because I grew up hearing the stories between my uncles and my grandfather. And they would always talk about him and his exploits, and all the many things that he did. I just wish I had a tape recorder, because there's so many things I wish I could remember from those days. After a while, you tuned it out and didn't listen to it. But when my uncle gave me all of those things, and I'm at his house, and he had it in another flat half garage, and he's telling me that everything is fine. He's 90 years old, everything is fine. Well, I stood there one day during a rainstorm, and I'm looking at 3 waterfalls coming in on all this history. And you want to see a grown man start to tear up and about cry. That was me. I was so upset, and he was staying at my house at the time. And I came home, and I just yelled at him, "What were you thinking? How could you let it get like this? I would have bought you the plastic containers." And he just looked at me and he said, "Everything's fine." And I realized at 90 years old, everything was just fine, and I never spoke to him again about it. I just did my best, saved what I could. The sad part was very difficult, was throwing away bricks of photographs that were soaking wet and literally were glued together. And all I could do was wonder what was in the pile and throw it away. And that was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life when it comes to our family, you know, growing up here. My grandfather, a little background on him, used to be a paper proofer for the mint back in the 20s, and then later on wound up working for the Department of Agriculture as a food preservationist and a scientist and a chemist. He actually came up with most of the food preservatives of the day, and even was the guy that invented the potato chip bag. The ones that we all take for granted today, the bag with the foil lined inside it, he was the one that came up with that idea, sold his idea to Lay's potato chips. Of course, he worked for the government, so he didn't make anything on it, but he told them to get with Reynolds Aluminum and make this bag, and of course they saved thousands of dollars. And, you know, they paid him a little pittance for that, but he was smart enough to start a stock pertaining to certain things on it, which I think helped him out until it went bust in the 70s. But you know, unfortunately I never met him. He died 9 years before I was born. My oldest cousin, if you look in those photos, you'll see a picture of a little girl sitting on his knees. That's my cousin Mary Beth. She's 75 years old today and has a lot of fond memories of him. And I tell her to write them down and send them to me, because hopefully one day there will be a book on him. And there's so much information. I could probably sit here for another 2 hours, and I don't want to bore everybody to death with that. But I talk to my brother every now and then, begging him to tell me more stories. And you know, all he remembers is bringing shots of whiskey to him for breakfast and a shot of whiskey at night before he went to bed. So, well, I guess when you're 98, you can tolerate that and not worry about it. But yeah, it's pretty sad. They think he would have easily made it to 100 if he hadn't broke his hip. But yeah, I'm already sweating to death in this, and I'm in a semi-air-conditioned room, so I don't know how he would do it standing on the deck of a ship, going up and down the coast of Florida with no radios. No, anything. All he had was a compass and an idea where he was going. So I just have a hard time imagining that. But most of the time he kept the boat in Jacksonville and would come down by train from D.C. and go and pick up his boat. And he would take a month to almost 2-month vacation going up and down the coast of Florida, because that was a winter time. Everything closed in D.C. back in those days. So I just kind of try to imagine taking a 2-month vacation. And luckily for me, I have his logbooks. It's going back as far as 1902, when he was on the Chesapeake Bay exploring there. And then I have his logbooks from Florida on into the 40s. So there's a lot of material in there for a someday book, I hope. The problem is it's going to take me a lifetime just to digest it all. And I keep seeing all these passages. The Historical Museum in Jupiter, the Lighthouse Museum, I had brought them one of the books, and they scanned it for me, and they were very fascinated, because it was 2 weeks just on the Jupiter stay, and seeing the Du Bois and all the Carlins, and going to the lighthouse and getting private tours. And one day the gentleman, the curator, calls me up one day, and he says, "Oh my God, I can't believe this." I said, What? He says, "I was going through the journal again." I said, "The logbook?" I said, "Yes." And he says, "Your great-grandfather answered a question for me I've been trying to find out since I started here." And I go, "What's that?" He says, "There was a well on the property. There's no record of how deep it was. Your great-grandfather apparently asked and wrote it in his logbooks." So he was tickled to death. I mean, he was naming everybody that he saw. He was very meticulous. He'd have the temperatures, the water conditions. I mean, everything that he felt relevant was in these log books. And everywhere he stopped, every fish that he caught, I mean, it's just too much material. And friends of mine that write historical books are telling me, he said, you have way too much material, you ought to do 2 or 3 books. I said, whoa, first I got to write the first one. And that's the hard part, but I've started the intro, and I have a good friend of mine who's written several books, and she's going to help me out. But well, I think I'm running out of material, and I don't want to keep you here all night, but anyone have any questions they'd like to ask about Coe, or anything in particular? There we go.
Yes, whenever you do a study, you really go in depth on a person, whether it's a relative or not.
Oh, yeah.
I have found there's those stories that you find that you go, my God, is there one story that stands out in your mind that Captain Coe either did, discovered, and got involved, nearly got killed from, whatever?
Oh boy, there's quite a few of those, but I do actually, and let me put this over here for a second. I actually do tell a story, and it's not life-changing or altering, but it's a kind of a funny little story. But often what he would do is hire out somebody to help him. As he got older, you know, I mean, he wound up doing this till he was in his 90s, for God's sakes. And, you know, he would have my relatives, my grandfather or uncles go with him, and sometimes he would charter out somebody from the area where he lived. And I've actually got one of the contracts at home where he was having somebody go along and what they would do for each other and so on and so forth. And, but sometimes he couldn't get anyone to go with him, and what he would do is go to the various towns that he was familiar with, and he would hire on cabin boys, which was not uncommon, you know, find a young strapping man that was willing to work for however much he was going to pay them. And so one day he's in one of the northern towns of Florida, and stopped and got a young man to help him out, and was paying him, you know, pennies a day basically. And the young man was working very hard, but what he didn't realize is the young man at that time was that the young man was getting a little frustrated. He didn't think he was getting paid enough for what he was doing. And it was backbreaking work, you know, excavating sites like this and finding all the artifacts. And, you know, Charles Coe was very meticulous there. When I was a kid, there were stacks of these ledgers at home in this shed, and you would open them up and there'd be numbers. And you'd go to the shelf and there'd be boxes and bags, and you'd go pull that number off there, and it would tell you where he found them, when he found them, and where, you know, there was a lot of, you know, typical archaeologist type of information. But so there was a lot involved in it. So eventually this little kid was, you know, getting a little frustrated here, and while they were digging in one of the mounds, you know, Captain Coe's off to one side, and the boys over there, and he finds something in the mound, and he goes, "This looks expensive. I'm keeping this. I'm not giving this to him." So he put it in his pocket and disappeared, you know. But then when they went back to the boat, when Coe was up on the deck, he was down, he found a little hiding spot, and he put it there and figured, I'm going to be rich from this. I'm going to make lots of money, and, you know, I'll have made up the difference. So the next town they went to, and forgive me for not having the information, this has been handed down through my family in the story, so, but apparently they came to a big town of the time, and so he decided to treat the young man to dinner at a fancy restaurant. This boy had never seen a real restaurant before. He was from such a small town. And he bought him a dinner and desserts and everything. This kid was like, wow, I've never seen anything like this. And there just happened to be a movie theater in this town. So he took him to the kid's first theater. And we're talking like the 20s and 30s here. So this was, you know, the silent movies. And this kid had never seen anything like this. And when they were done and they were heading back to the boat, the kid was just walking with his head down. And finally he says, "What's wrong?" And he says, I have something to tell you." He says, "You really, I feel so bad. You treated me so wonderfully, took me to dinner, and I saw my first movie. It was the greatest thing, and I have to tell you something. I stole from you." "You stole from me?" He said, what could you have stolen?" "Well, it was something very valuable on the mounds, and I need to give it to you." He said, "Well, what is it?" He said, "Well, let me show you." So they went back to the boat. He takes him to this little spot, and he digs it out, and he says, "Well, what have you got there, boy?" He says, "I've got a diamond." And he goes, Of course, Captain Coe looks at that and starts laughing. He says, "No, son, there were no diamonds here." He says, but he got a good laugh out. He says, "No, actually, son, that was a common item during the Spanish era. And this is a calcium carbonate crystal. They do have them in the Carolinas, but in South America, these are common. They're everywhere. They come in blocks. And actually, Spain had hired people to go down there, jewelers actually, to cut these things and polish them, and they would sell them in Europe, claiming that this is the way they would find them. And they were actually cut this way. But if you look at them, they're just oddly shaped, and they were fair. The only thing we can figure is that it was on a Spanish ship that went down off the coast of Florida. And commonly what the natives would do here is what they call wrecking. You know, they would go aboard the ships and just clean them out and just, wipe out everything, the gold and, the coins, powder, whatever they could find. And that was pretty commonplace. But no, this wasn't a diamond. So now all I can say is this is the family fortune for us, is the Coe diamond. So and sadly, a little remark, the copper baron in the family, who was extraordinarily wealthy and owned what was at the time the largest brass manufacturing company in America in the 1870s, when the family was dying out, and the last Coe member before my great-grandfather left him in the will to get a pretty sizable fortune, because a lot of this money was spread out to all different societies. It was money left to go to removing all the homes from their property and becoming a park according to the will, and a large trust fund was left for that park, still paying for that park today to acquire extra lands, do upkeep. Part of the provision was to drag a 15-ton boulder to the center of the park with a large bronze plaque. I've seen a picture of the boulder and the plaque, but I can't read the plaque. And it's still there today, but if you're anywhere near Torrington, if you look around, and you can ask for Coe Park, and it's still there today. The local historical museums were beside themselves. The historical people were beside themselves because all the houses were mowed down to make way for this park. And they were all just, except I've talked to some of them today, and people who weren't even there are still upset about it. But I think there was one more quick story, like you were saying. When William Coe, my great-great-grandfather, passed away as port collector, it was tradition for the son to take over as port collector. They would be temporarily put into place. I actually have their state appointment papers for both of them at home. I mean, that's how much stuff I have. But if you look, there's a little article in there, and you'll see like a ship drawn at the bottom of it, and it talks about an experience during one of the hurricanes, or one of the big storms. A ship washed up, and all the townsfolk decided to become wreckers, and they were cleaning this boat out. And my great-grandfather got a letter from Tallahassee to do everything he could to keep these people from taking all the goods, to protect it. And he says, well, that's a little tough when these people are your friends, neighbors, including the mayor, who offered bodily harm to anyone that tried to stop him. So, that was actually in a newspaper, and that was actually printed in a book called Shipwrecks of Florida. And I've actually spoke to the author, and he was telling me where he got that from. It was actually an old newspaper article from the 1880s. So I've been trying to find that article. I would love to find it, but anyone else? I guess that's a no. Well, I hope I was somewhat entertaining. Might have learned a few things about him. I actually have a couple things we want to look at, and we can go from there.
Thank you. We enjoyed it very much.
No problem. Yes? Oh, you want to look at it? Oh, here you go.
That's the biggest diamond you'll ever see.
Yeah. What they use it for?
Thank you.
Well, like I said, they used it for display. I mean, it would be like a conversation piece, or they would try to sell it like it was actual jewelry. They'd never seen anything like this in Europe. But like I said, it's just, there's fields of it in South America, but it's just a common material down there. And they profit. They just, like I said, if you look at the shapes of it,
Yeah.
it's not a standard shape. It's not square, and it's tilted. Everything. It's just a geometrical oddity. Yeah. Give me my $5.
Thank you very much.
No
That was
problem.
very interesting. Don't forget, we have Alice's book for sale over there, and hope to see all of you next month. Thank you.
There's a little handout here.